The Inheritance of the Sorcerer, Kings' Chapter 1. The Bell That Did Not Answer. I am Bryce Vayer, keeper of the Quiet Archive, and this is Chapter 1, The Bell That Did Not Answer. Before I tell you what broke in Belgrave, I want you to understand what was whole. There are towns that trust rivers. They build their homes close to the water, orient their streets toward the current, and depend on the flood for the richness of their soil. They know the river may rise, may change course, may drown a season's crop or swallow a street entire, but they build close to it anyway, because in all the generations of their remembering, the river has given more than it has taken. Their trust is not ignorance. It is arithmetic. Belgrave trusted the gods the way those towns trust rivers. 3 generations back, a plague had come to Belgrave in autumn, moving through the river quarter first and then up through the market, the mill district, the Tanner Rows. The priests of the Covenant of the Seven Lamps had stayed when the town's wealthy fled north. They had prayed over the dying until their knees bled against the flagstones, and the gods had answered, not quickly, not without cost, but answered. The sick recovered, the air cleared. The harvest, stunted and strange-tasting, came in nonetheless. Belgrave remembered this. It remembered the way towns do, in feast days, in the names carved above the hospital door, and the habit of mothers kissing prayer ribbons before tying them to their children's wrists. The gods were not abstractions in Belgrave. They were practical. They were present. They were, as far as anyone alive had ever witnessed, reliable. I tell you this not to make the failure more dramatic. It requires no help. But to make it honest. Belgrave was not a town of foolish faith. It was a town that had been given sufficient reason, across sufficient time, to trust. What happened there was not the punishment of naivety. It was something worse, the sudden subtraction of something that had always been there before, without warning, without explanation, without mercy. It began, as most catastrophes do, on an otherwise ordinary morning. The temple bell rang before dawn. It rang the way it always did. 3 strokes for the first lamp, a pause, then the long rolling peal that served as Belgrave's communal heartbeat. In the sleeping rooms above the market, people turned in their beds toward the sound without fully waking, the way a sleeping dog turns toward a familiar voice. In the river quarter, bakers began shaping loaves. At the mill, a boy of 11 kicked off his blanket and pulled on his boots without lighting a candle. Because he had made this walk so many times, his feet knew the path. In the white stone courtyard of the Temple Hospital, Sister Eloan Thrice. Spared was already awake, already working, already unremarkable in her steadiness. She had been a healer for 23 years. Her hands were red from washing. Her sleeves were rolled past the elbow even in the morning chill, and she moved through the hospital's outer ward the way water moves through a mill race, purposefully, without waste, shaped entirely by the work ahead of her. Junior healers watched her and tried to learn from watching. What most of them learned was that she did not waste breath on comfort that distracted from medicine, and that when she did speak gently, the gentleness was always exact. "Sit up for me," she said to the old woman in the corner bed. "That's it. Breathe." The old woman's name was Para. She had come in 3 days prior with a chest wound that had gone septic, and she had not been expected to last the first night. Now she sat upright, her breath labored but present, her color moving slowly back toward something living. Eloan placed her hands on Para's chest, closed her eyes briefly, and spoke the morning rite. The words were familiar enough that she did not need to think them. She had spoken them so many times that they had become a kind of breathing, the way certain prayers become breathing for people who say them long enough. A warm amber light kindled briefly at the points of contact, the kind of light that Belgrave's people took entirely for granted, the way people take sunrise for granted. The light settled into Para's chest. Some of the tightness left the old woman's face. "Thank the lamps," Para said. Then, as an afterthought, quieter, "Thank you, sister." Eloan nodded, already moving toward the next bed, already looking ahead at the morning's work. 8 patients stable, 2 uncertain, 1 who had been brought in overnight and whose injury she had not yet assessed. Ordinary numbers, on an ordinary morning. The lamps in their colored glass holders glowed amber and teal above the ward, and from the courtyard came the sound of sandals on wet stone, of water being poured into basins, of a junior healer reciting the cleansing rites in a voice that cracked slightly on the high note. He was new, and still embarrassed by his mistakes. Near the hospital service entrance, half hidden behind a stack of linen baskets, a man sat on an upturned crate and sorted bandages without being asked to. His name was Cale Orison. He was not a healer. He was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be in the hospital's back storage at all. But Eloan had long since stopped remarking on his presence there. partly because he was useful, and partly because she recognized, in his habit of helping without drawing attention to it, a quality she respected. He was not here for credit. He sorted the clean bandages from the used, the usable from the too far gone, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself undemanding. He was a quiet man, K.L., gentle in his movements, the kind of person who habitually held doors and did not expect to be thanked. He had come to Belgrave 4 months prior and taken up residence above a cobbler's shop on the riverside, and as far as anyone knew, he had no occupation that could be named. He helped where helping was needed. He paid his rent on time. He did not pray in the temple, which in Belgrave was noticed the way left-handedness is noticed, observed, occasionally remarked upon, not yet held against him. "You don't have to be here this early," said a junior healer passing with an armload of clean sheets. "I know," Kyle said, and went on sorting. He had heard, when old Para thanked the god first and Elowen second, the familiar small hierarchy of credit that governed this hospital, this town, this world. The god gave the healing. The healer was the channel. The patient's gratitude flowed accordingly, upward first, and then, if there was any left over, toward the mortal hands that had stayed awake all night to direct it. Kale said nothing about this. He had learned over the years that saying something about it helped no one. The bell rang again at past dawn. The ward settled into its morning rhythm. Rain tapped at the high windows, gentle and persistent. The smell of incense and boiled linen hung in the air like habitual blessing. The mother came in just as the sun broke the horizon. She was a weaver's wife from the South Quarter, Kale thought, or he supposed so, from the calluses on her fingers and the particular way she carried her child with her arms wrapped like a loom shuttle. Efficient, not tender, but that was exhaustion, not indifference. The child was a boy of perhaps 4 years. He was very hot. Elowen looked up from her assessment notes and gestured to the side chamber without a word. 2. The side chamber was smaller and quieter than the main ward, a single window, a reed-woven privacy screen, 3 treatment beds of which 2 were currently empty. It smelled of fever, that specific smell, thin and metallic and faintly sweet, which Elowen could identify from the doorway before she ever touched a patient. She settled the child on the nearest bed. He was conscious but not fully present, his eyes glassy with fever heat and his small fists clutching the weaver wife's sleeve with the single-minded grip of someone very young and very frightened. The mother's name was Tinna, and she had the look of a woman who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 days. She watched Elowen's face with the focused attention of someone who had already decided that the healer's expression would tell her everything she needed to know. Elowen kept her expression professionally composed. "How long?" she asked. 3 nights, Tinna said. "We tried the cold cloths, we tried the bark tea. Last night he could not hold water." Elowen nodded. She had seen this before. The fever had gone too deep, lodged in the places where cold cloths and bark tea could not reach. She lit the small lamp beside the bed, a lamp filled with oil of hyssop, blessed that morning under the first lamp's rite, and she placed her hands on the boy's forehead and his sternum, as she had done 10,000 times before. She spoke the healing prayer. The words were old, older than Belgrave, older than the current temple architecture. They had a particular weight and rhythm that Elowen found, after 23 years, almost impossible to say wrong. The way certain songs become part of the body, so that even half asleep or frightened you could still find the melody. She said them correctly. She had said them correctly 10,000 times before. The lamp flickered. Nothing else happened. Tinna's hands tightened on her son's arm. Elowen did not allow herself to move, or to let anything shift in her face. She took a breath, recentered, and spoke the prayer again, with more deliberateness this time, more attention to the weight of each syllable, the specific intention behind the specific words. She had done this before when distraction had thinned a prayer. She had done it when grief or exhaustion made the connection uncertain. You spoke more carefully. You made the prayer exact. The gods answered exactness. The lamp flickered again. Nothing else happened. The room became very quiet, not the quiet of reverence, the other kind. The kind that arrives when something expected does not arrive. The silence of a step taken onto ground that should hold and does not. "Did I say something wrong?" Tinna whispered. She was looking at her own hands, as though the fault might be hers, as though insufficient prayer on a mother's part might explain why her child was not being healed. "No," Elowen said. "You said nothing wrong. Bring cool water." "Now." Kale had been standing in the doorway. He had followed from the ward, moving so quietly that no one had registered him, and he saw Alowan's hands, still hovering an inch above the child's brow, not moving, not retreating, simply waiting with a stillness that was different from calm. He saw the lamp, still burning, still physically lit, still giving light, simply not giving anything else. "Why didn't the lamp answer?" he said. Alowan looked at him then, just briefly. The look told him that she knew the answer was going to be large and that she was not yet ready to say it. "Fetch the junior from the outer ward," she said instead. "Tell him I need the second kit. Don't explain why. Don't explain anything." Kael went. Behind him, as he walked back through the ward, he heard Tinna begin to pray on her own, louder this time, as if volume might compensate for whatever she imagined she had failed to give. The lamp kept burning. The boy kept burning. And in the cold lamplight of the side chamber, Elowen thrice. Spared looked at her own hands and remembered, with the bone-deep recognition of someone who has always feared a specific letter's arrival, that she had been in this room before. I-3. They found out in pieces, the way all hospital disasters are found out, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of small wrongnesses that eventually refuse to be explained individually. In the outer ward, a quarryman who had come in the previous day with a deep gash along his forearm, stable, healing, expected to leave by midday, woke to find his wound had not closed overnight the way it should have. The senior healer on the ward repeated the sealing rite twice. The edges of the wound remained edges. His blood, when it seeped through the new bandaging, showed no sign of the sacred congealing that the rite should have encouraged. In the birth chamber at the far end of the temple's south wing, a priest named Ovoth had been midwifing a difficult delivery. The child was presenting wrong, and he had called on the stabilizing rite that the Covenant used in such cases, the one that eased the body's resistance, that turned fear and pain into something more like a controlled passage. It did not come. He tried again. The mother's pain sharpened. He sent for Elowan. In the shrine alcove beside the hospital entrance, a merchant who had been waiting with a cracked rib, an impatient man, accustomed to having his body repaired efficiently and without disruption to his schedule, caught the arm of a passing junior healer and demanded to know why he had now been waiting 2 extra hours without the promised rite. The junior healer could not explain this. The junior healer was beginning, quietly, to panic. In the resurrection preparation room on the upper floor, a room that most of the hospital's ordinary patients never knew existed, that existed in most Covenant hospitals as a necessity of last resort. 2 priests had been preparing to begin the rites for a young woman who had died in the night of a burst vessel in her head. The woman had a family. The family had money. The resurrection had been arranged. The priests knelt in position, spoke the opening words, and waited for the warmth that should have come into their hands. They waited a long time. Then one of them quietly went downstairs to find the hospital's most senior official. Mara Vey was not a healer. She was the Covenant's marshal in Belgrave, part administrator, part judicial officer, part physical enforcement, if enforcement was needed, though Belgrave was not the kind of town that had required much of that. She had the build of someone trained from childhood for armor, broad through the shoulders, economical in movement, and she wore her faith with the same unself-conscious naturalness that she wore her pauldrons, not as display, but as practical protection. She arrived in the hospital's main corridor at approximately the 4th hour after dawn, because word had begun to reach her through the standard channels of administrative concern, a note from a senior healer, a second-hand report from the shrine alcove, and she had enough experience to recognize that when multiple concerning reports arrived through independent channels within a short period, they were usually describing the same underlying event. She took one look at the state of the outer ward and began issuing commands. "Close the public entrance. Keep anyone currently inside. No one leaves until we know what we're dealing with. Send a junior to the magistrate's house and tell him I need his office made available for coordination. You," she pointed to a priest who was staring at his own hands as though they had betrayed him, "you are going to look at me, not at your hands, and you are going to walk calmly to the supply room and bring me the triage records from the last 3 days. Can you do that?" The priest looked up, swallowed, nodded. "Good." Alowan appeared at her elbow, having come from the birth chamber with blood on her sleeve and the expression of someone who had not slept and was not planning to. "The delivery came right eventually," she said quietly, conventionally. "No prayer involved." "How is she?" Mara asked. "Alive. Frightened. They both are." Elowen paused. "The rites are not working, Mara. None of them. Not the sealing, not the stabilizing, not the preparation upstairs." She kept her voice below the noise of the ward. "This is not a single failed prayer. Are you certain?" Alowan looked at her with the directness of someone who does not have time for careful phrasing. "I have been in this hospital for 19 years. I have had prayers fail because of illness, exhaustion, distraction, and grief. I have had lamps burn in pure oil and lamps that needed reconsecrating. I have had novices mispronounce the words in ways that mattered." She glanced down at the ward floor, where a bowl of pink water sat forgotten beside an empty stretcher. "I have not had every rite in a hospital fail simultaneously, on a morning when the oil is fresh and the novices are supervised and there is no earthly reason for it." A priest on the far side of the ward spoke up, a young man, red-faced with the particular shame of someone convinced that a problem can be solved with sufficient personal virtue. "It may be improper ritual form," he said, "if someone in the preparation room failed to observe the—" "It is not improper form," Alowan said without raising her voice. "It is not bad oil, and it is not mispronounced prayers, and it is not anyone's failures of virtue." She said this with a flatness that cut through the young priest's argument the way a sharp knife cuts, not through force but through simple precision. "Please, do not make this worse by deciding someone is at fault before we understand what is happening." Kael, standing nearby with a fresh armload of bandages he had retrieved from storage, watched Mara's face during this exchange. She was listening to Alowan carefully, her expression held in a deliberate stillness that he recognized, after 4 months in Belgrave, as her method of concealing things she could not afford to show in a room full of frightened people. He knew what that kind of stillness cost. He had practiced it himself. One of the senior priests raised the obvious question: "Should we send word to Caer Thaler?" Alowan's reaction was brief. A half-second's tension in her jaw, a slight tightening around the eyes. But it was there. "Let us understand what we are reporting," she said, "before we report it." Mara noticed. Kael noticed that she noticed. The ward continued its imperfect work. Bowls of cold water, clean bandages, hands that were merely human, doing what they could. IV. The supply room was narrow and damp and smelled of lye and iron. Shelves on both sides held folded linens, ceramic jars of medicinal oils, boxes of dried herbs, and a haphazard stack of old triage ledgers that had been meaning to be reorganized since before Alowan had come to Belgrave. There was room for 2 people to stand, if it did not mind being close. Mara closed the door. "Has this happened before?" Alowan was lifting a jar from the lower shelf. She did not turn around. "You should keep your voice lower in here," she said. "There are storage rooms on either side of this wall. Alowan, the walls are thin. I'm asking you a direct question." A pause. Alowan set the jar on the shelf above and turned. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone measuring how much truth a given room can hold. "I have been a healer for 23 years, she said. "I have been a healer in Belgrave for 19 of them. In that time, I have dealt with failed rites, inconsistent results, and the ordinary variations that come with any practical art. None of those are this." She stopped. "What I know beyond that is something I am still deciding whether to say. People are dying." The words came from the doorway. Kael, who had apparently not gone to the outer ward at all, but had remained within hearing distance, which he did not apologize for. "People are dying while you decide what this is allowed to be called." Mara looked at him. "This is a private conversation." "I know," he said, "but the patients in the ward can hear it too." He was not confrontational about this. He simply said it as information, in the same tone he had used to sort bandages and fetch water all morning, the tone of someone who finds the practical problem more urgent than the social one. Mara turned back to Eowyn. "Panic kills people faster than silence," she said. "If people in this hospital and in this town believe the gods have withdrawn, they will act on that belief before we have any way to help them. I need to know what we are dealing with and how serious it is. And I need to know that before you decide whether it is politic to tell me." "False certainty also kills," Eowyn said. "I am not asking for certainty. I am asking for your honest assessment." Another pause. Outside, through the thin walls, they could hear the ward, the low sounds of pain, the murmured instructions of healers working without divine assistance, the small, awful sounds of people suffering through what should already have been resolved. "My honest assessment," Eowyn said at last, and her voice was quieter now and careful, "is that I am not surprised enough. That is what frightens me most. I should be more surprised." She picked up the jar again and moved toward the door. "If I find what I think I might find, I will tell you both. Tonight, if I can manage it." The bell rang noon. From inside the supply room, it sounded different than it had at dawn. The same sound, the same bronze notes, but with some quality of meaning subtracted, as though the bell were going through the motions of prayer while something underneath it had gone quiet. By noon, the word had escaped. Not in any organized way. Mara had been careful about the hospital's external communications, and the messages to the magistrate's office had been measured, but these things could not be held inside stone walls forever. A wife visiting her husband in the ward had seen the failed rite. A junior healer, not yet skilled in the art of saying nothing, had let something slip to a friend at the market gate. A priest buying bread had been asked why the morning bell had not carried its usual resonance, and had not been able to produce a convincing answer. By midday, 24 people were kneeling at the shrine steps outside the temple. Kale walked through the market quarter because Mara had sent him for additional supplies from the apothecary. The hospital was running low on things that medicine required, and prayer did not, and he moved through the midday streets with the specific attention of someone trying not to draw notice while noticing everything. The town was doing what towns do when something sacred fails. It was generating explanation. He heard, in the space of one market square, that Belgrave was being punished for a heretic who had sheltered there the previous winter, that a family in the river quarter had not paid their temple tithe, that the gods were testing Belgrave as they had once tested a village in the east that had doubted the miracle of the fourth lamp, that someone had said the wrong name during a wedding rite and the error had compounded over 3 days until heaven's attention had shifted, that it was the weather, specifically, that was interfering with divine channels. People were kneeling in the mud and praying louder than they usually prayed. It was the particular kind of loudness that comes when someone suspects they might not be being heard, and is responding by increasing the volume of transmission, rather than examining the reception. Belgrave has always been faithful, a man near the shrine steps was saying, to no one in particular, his voice carrying the slightly too insistent quality of someone convincing themselves. We have always held our obligations. The tithe is current. The feast days have been observed. There is no reason. Then what debt has not been paid? Asked a woman nearby, and the question had no obvious target, which made it land harder than a directed accusation. Kael stopped at the apothecary's counter and gave Mara his list without comment. While the apothecary's apprentice moved through the back room, he stood and looked at the shrine steps and felt something that had been quiet in him for years, beginning, reluctantly, to wake. He had, once, knelt somewhere like those steps. He had knelt until his knees bled and his voice gave out, and he had prayed with the total and ruinous sincerity of a child who believes, absolutely, that if he is good enough and loud enough and faithful enough, the God will hear. He had been 17. His mother had been very sick. The God had not answered. She had died anyway. Kael looked at the kneeling townspeople of Belgrave and felt, alongside the grief that had never fully metabolized, a complicated anger, not at the people kneeling, who were doing exactly what they had been taught to do, but at the gap between what they had been taught and what was actually true. He did not know, yet, the full shape of that gap. He only knew it was there, and that its edges were sharp. A messenger on a bay horse pushed through the market crowd, heading toward the south road. Headed, presumably, toward Caer Thalor. The hospital doors opened again behind him. More stretchers. More people who had been sent away that morning, when the healers had hoped the morning might resolve itself, being brought back in. VIs. The hospital worked through the afternoon without the gods. This is not a small thing to say. It should not be passed over quickly. An entire infrastructure of healing, one that Belgrave had depended on for 3 generations, that Elowen had built her practice around for 23 years, that priests had spent their lives learning to channel, simply did not function, and the gap it left was enormous and immediate and filled, imperfectly, by human hands. Elowen moved through the ward with the triage logic of someone who has thought, probably more than once, about what medicine would look like without divine assistance, who gets cooling cloths, who gets the willow bark, who needs stitching rather than waiting for sacred sealing, who cannot be saved by anything the hospital currently has and must be told so, in a way that does not cause the others to despair. She had not been taught this in her training. She was working from first principles and old knowledge, and the kind of stubborn, practical intelligence that does not wait for permission to be useful. Hold the compress there, she told a junior healer, who was staring at his hands with the expression of someone whose professional identity had just evaporated. Not like a prayer, like a press. You are slowing bleeding with pressure, not with intention. Pressure. There. But the right is not answering today. The pressure is. Use the pressure. Mara had removed her gauntlets. This, in itself, said something. She was not a healer. She could not perform rites, but she could hold things and lift things and physically restrain patients who were in enough pain to hurt themselves or others, and when Aloan pointed at a task, she did it without asking whether it was appropriate for a Covenant marshal to be doing the work of a hospital orderly. She had, at some point in the afternoon, pulled her hair back and secured it with a bandage strip because it kept falling into her face. Kael had not left. This was the honest truth of him. He had had, multiple times during that long afternoon, the thought that he should leave. He had no formal obligation here. No one had drafted him. The hospital had no claim on him, and he had spent enough years ensuring that no one could claim him through debt or duty or gratitude that the absence of obligation should have been, in theory, sufficient to free him. He had thought, I can go back to the cobbler's rooms. I can close the door. This is not mine. And then a woman had cried out in the birth chamber, and a child had begun to cough blood in the inner ward, and a man who had been stable at noon had taken a turn that required 2 people to manage, and Kael had been standing there, and the thought of leaving had simply not been strong enough. He worked beside a priest whose name he did not know, sponging down a fever patient with water that was cooling as fast as it could be changed. The priest prayed under his breath. Not the formal healing rites, which were not working, but the informal prayers of a man who could not stop believing that saying something to heaven was better than saying nothing. Kael did not pray. But when the patient turned toward him with the glassy, searching eyes of someone in extremis, looking for something, some assurance, Kael met his eyes and stayed there and did not look away. He was not, in that moment, performing anything. He was simply refusing to abandon a field he had already chosen. Can you hear me? The man asked. Yes, Kael said. Is it? Will it? I'm here, Kael said. I'm not going anywhere. Not theology. Not comfort built on promise. Just presence. By dusk, the hospital had lost 3 patients. Not 3 more. 3 total. Which was, under the circumstances, a number that Aloan allowed herself to acknowledge in the back of her mind as less terrible than she had feared. It did not feel like success. It felt like surviving the first day of something that might have many days left in it. Outside, the dusk bell rang, then the evening bell, then the late bell. The night bell did not ring. This was noticed. Not loudly. There was no one outside in the rain to listen for it with anything like ordinary attention. But it was noticed. The bell tower of Belgrave's temple had rung at the prescribed hours since the temple's founding, through plague and drought and the death of 3 successive high priests and 2 contested elections. It was, as far as anyone alive could remember, without exception. Tonight it was silent because the temple attendant, a man named Drev who had pulled the rope at its appointed hours for 11 years, was inside the hospital. He was pressing a compress against the shoulder of a woman who had begun to bleed in the afternoon and had not stopped. He would pull the bell rope again, he told himself when his hands were free. His hands had not been free since the 3rd hour after noon. It was not only him. Across Belgrave's hospital, every hand that might ordinarily have rung the night bell was occupied. The healers, the priests, the marshals, the volunteers who had come in over the course of the afternoon to do what they could, the ordinary frightened citizens who had found that the best treatment for fear of helplessness was the act of helping. Aloan, stopping for the first time in 12 hours in the doorway of the outer ward, looked up at the ceiling as though she could see through it to the bell tower above. If the gods will not hold them, she said, quiet enough that only Kael, standing nearby, could hear, then we will. It was not a speech. It was not ideology. It was a statement of practical fact from a woman who intended to do exactly what she had said, for as long as her body would permit her to continue doing it. Kael looked at her. Then he went back to the ward. V, I want to be precise about what you should hold from this night. Belgrave did not fall. It did not descend into the kind of chaos that dramatic histories prefer. No riot, no public apostasy, no collapse of the civic order into screaming and ash. What happened was quieter and in some ways worse. An ordinary town discovered, in the span of a single ordinary day, that the thing it had depended on for 3 generations was no longer present. And then it kept going. Aloan kept working. Mara kept organizing. Kael kept staying when he had every reason to leave. The priests who could not heal tried to help in other ways. The townspeople brought food to the hospital doors. The building stayed upright. The patients who could be saved were. I do not tell you this to comfort you. I tell you this because I want you to understand the quality of the people this story belongs to. They were not saints, and they were not heroes in any sense that requires a song. They were simply people who had learned, in the space of a crisis, that when the miraculous is absent, the ordinary must be enough. They made it enough, imperfectly, painfully, at cost. What none of them knew, as the rain fell on Belgrave through the night, and the hospital burned its lamps on oil alone, and the bell tower stood silent above the town, was that the silence in which they were laboring had a shape. It had edges. It had, somewhere in the world that night, a woman holding a dark and horn-like object in her hands and whispering to it with the desperate precision of someone who has stopped being able to tell the difference between an answer and her need for one. But that is the next chapter. For now, the bells of Belgrave rang for morning prayer, then noon, then dusk. By nightfall, no one rang them at all. Not because the gods had forbidden it, not because the priests had ordered silence, but because every hand in the temple was busy holding down the dying.